What lessons can we draw from the pandemic to foster climate action? How can ethics and trust make a difference in the public debate and ultimately in political decision making? These are some of the questions that will be addressed in today's talk, and I really look forward to an inspiring conversation.
Augustin Präniaur is also active in the public debate on climate policy and the ecological transition in Switzerland. So thank you very much for being with us today, Augustin. The stage is now yours.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Leah. It is my turn first to thank the Swiss Embassy and the Heschel Center for this kind invitation, and I really look forward talking with you about all these very important topics. So one first common issue, or common feature, I would say, between the COVID and climate change is that both are fundamentally moral issues. They are basically ethical questions. We are not used to think in moral terms anymore today, but if we think of it, the need to protect the most vulnerable is the keyword of most countries' response to the COVID-19 pandemic. This moral imperative, protect the vulnerable, is a virtually universal ethical principle found in most human societies. In democratic countries, in particular, it is strongly associated with the enjoyment by each individual of fundamental rights, including the right to life, the right to health, the right to subsistence, and so on. And the enjoyment of these rights is considered independent, and that's an important point, so I'd like to emphasize it. It's independent on the person's identity and particular circumstances of life. These rights are granted to people solely by virtue of the fact that they are human beings, and that's why we call them human rights. So there are differences in the very basic characteristics of the two crises, of these two problems, and in the way they influence the way we perceive them. So if we take the dimension of time, the time dimension, for example, it is clear that COVID is a rapidly spreading disease. It's very fast, whereas climate change is slow, progressive, and intergenerational. And indeed, to be very accurate, climate change, we should not frame it as a crisis because there won't be a huge problem and then back to the normal. Climate change will be a new normal. It will change things forever. There is some kind of irreversibility involved in climate change, and that makes also a huge difference. In space, there are also differences. COVID is threatening us and our beloved ones directly, whereas climate change appears, at least for most people, like a more distant threat. People are not, at least in developed countries, those who contribute the most to the causes of climate change, people are not suffering every day from climate change. So it's hard to imagine that as a very proximate threat. The causal pathway for those two crises is different as well. COVID is a very simple and straightforward, even though it's complex, disease. We know more or less how people contaminate each other and how the disease spreads, even though we have some uncertainties left, but we know the mechanism. In climate change, we know how it works as well, but it's pretty indirect and complex phenomenon. Most of all, what's important and relevant here is that climate change is caused by a multiplicity of causes. It is the accumulation of a huge number of tiny contributions, CO2 emissions, that altogether accumulate in the atmosphere and create the problems. And the causal pathway is pretty indirect as well. So CO2 emissions have the effect of raising global temperature. The global temperature causes extreme weather events. And these weather events, for example, cause harm to a lot of people. So it's pretty indirect. And when it comes to our emotional self, there are also differences in the way we perceive those two emergencies. COVID appeals directly to our instinctive fears, whereas climate change, since it seems more distant, appeals, or should appeal at least, to our sense of morality. So it's more abstract in some kind. I said that, well, we should emphasize our role as citizens and political responses to climate change and emphasize the systemic dimension of the problem. But of course, building a strong political movement around a project of ecological transition requires a pretty high level of trust and adequate institutions. So trust in various things, trust in science first, because we need to agree on facts. We could disagree on how to deal with those facts, how to respond, so which policy we should implement to try to solve the problems, but we should agree on a minimal factual basis. And well, that's difficult right now because the trust in science and science institutions is eroding slowly because of climate denial, for example, or because of the fake news, all the fake news problems. But I won't have time to talk about that in any details, but it's of course very important. Second, we have to have trust in collective action. We need to be confident in the fact that we can build a movement and achieve a lot together, provided that people care about politics and are involved in political movement again. And here the risk would be a depoliticization of the people. The fact that people just retrench in their private life and don't care about the political debate, public debate, and public action anymore. But we desperately need to build again this will to participate in those movements. And we also need trust in political institutions, of course. And I'd like to talk more about the institutions here, because it raises an important question about the fitness of current democratic institutions to tackle environmental problems. So yeah, first question first on the fact that ethics and trust are poorly understood. And I think yes, and there's a reason for that, is that morality has become almost an ugly word in the realm of politics and economics. And that's why I think we should frame much more those problems as moral issues, it is what they are, and not only as just economic questions. And that's very important, and it would maybe help people understand more why it is important. And there's really an effort of education and pedagogy to do here to explain why it is basically a moral problem.
Why do you think moral questions aren't in vogue anymore? Why is it so hard to talk about morality today? Once morality was framed, it was a major frame of culture.
Great question. I think that people conflate a little bit what has to do with morality with what has to do with their private, with subjectivity and their private values. People think that morality is what I'm entitled to think on my own as an individual, and nobody has to tell me what I should think or how I should behave. People think that morality is a private matter, but I don't think so. Morality is part of our value system, and a value system is pretty culturally oriented, so it's a collective thing. And the morality is everywhere in our political institutions as well, in our economic system. The fact that our economic system tends to, this becomes a little technical, we have to have a utilitarian foundation. That is, what we value is fulfilling the preferences of individuals, and to do that, we have to give them a lot of different consumption choices, and that's the way they will reach happiness, for example. That's the fundamental hypothesis behind our economic model, but that's an ethical an ethical theory, an ethical position that we can discuss. And there are other moral theories and moral systems possible. So I think that morality is also a collective problem and not only individual. And what I wanted to say about progress is that we can also make progress in this field. We've witnessed that in the history of humanity. I think that the emergence of human rights was a huge progress. So we don't live up to this ideal yet, but we can still progress in that way. And tackling climate change would be a huge progress in this domain too. So progress is not only technological, it's not only economic, it might be in other domains too.
I cannot agree more. I think it's so important to redefine progress. I think it's much more important to make progress in these arenas. Actually, people nowadays, especially people that define themselves from the right, from the right side of the political map, value freedoms very, very much. Yeah. And actually, the economic system that we are trapped in reduces our freedoms, because we look at everything, at all the huge wealth that there is, as if everything can be regarded as in terms of economic transactions. And actually most of life and most of the things that we value most are in the commons and are in the households and are in the communities and not in the market. And it's not that we don't need markets, but we should give them the right proper place in the system and actually make progress in the other realms that were very, very much neglected in the last 50 years. I think this is part of the problems. Now we have so much stuff and we have too little of the things that we value most: time with our communities and children, healthy food, the things that really give joy in life, more time for being out in nature. There is no nature to go out to.